So the first verse I want to share with you is what I have to admit I want to be true about fear and love. From John 4:18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear expects punishment. The person who is afraid has not been made perfect in love. But what does the Bible say about fearing God? Fear your God. You must fear your God. Fear your God. Must fear your God. Over and over. Okay, but that's the Old Testament and largely the Torah. So what about the wisdom books? What does that have to say about fearing God? Fear of the Lord is where wisdom begins. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. The fear of the Lord is the fountain of life. Okay. But that's the Old Testament. Now, surely the New Testament doesn't say things like that. You know what it means to fear the Lord. We make our holiness complete in the fear of the Lord, fearing God. So let's look at 3 specific verses a little more closely. So we've got a verse from the New Testament, 2 Corinthians 7:1. My dear friends, since we have these promises, let's cleanse ourselves from anything that contaminates our body or spirit, so that we make our holiness complete in the fear of God. Then from Leviticus 19:32b, you must fear your God, I am the Lord. And finally from Proverbs 1:7, wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, but fools despise wisdom and instructions. All right. Well, I don't know about you, but the Bible says some things that make me uncomfortable, that I don't want to be true. Now, some of them are 1 verse here or 2 verses there, and sometimes I can convince myself that maybe it was mistranslated somewhere along the line, or that it meant something different at the time, and it's not really saying this thing that I don't want it to say. But it's really hard to do that when the Bible talks about fearing God, because as you saw, it says it so many times. So honestly, my approach in the past has been to do my best to ignore that and to convince myself that sometime in the future, at some unspecified time, I was going to try to understand that, because it just didn't connect with this loving God that I know that it's a good thing for us to fear God. So when Glenda kindly offered to give me the opportunity to preach again, I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll use this as the opportunity to really investigate the idea of fearing God, and force myself to face this topic, because I knew I was going to have to get in front of all of y'all and talk about it, right? Okay, so I read commentaries on it. I researched other meanings of the word fear. I read every verse in the Bible that talks about fear. I spent hours studying and praying and thinking about why it tells us to fear God and why fearing God would be a good thing. And as of yesterday morning, I still wasn't sure what I was going to say today. I found myself wondering if God was giving me an object lesson on fear, since it looked like I was going to show up this morning and beg Colin for us just to sing the entire hour. Okay. Well, while I definitely haven't solved these questions, I'd like to take you on the journey I've been on and share what I've learned so far, or think I've learned so far. So I started off considering whether there were alternate definitions of fear that might make the whole problem go away. Wouldn't that be nice? I found that the standard definition of fear is an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain, or a threat. Okay, but then there was this archaic definition. I thought, okay, now we're talking specifically, since the example said the love and fear of God. So I thought, well, this is spot on. But the definition says a mixed feeling of dread and reverence. Okay, the reverence part sounds good. Not so pleased with the dread, not moving in the direction I want. So then I looked up what dread was. Dread, great fear or apprehension. Okay, so I've gone from fear to great fear. Not quite doing what I want there. Okay. That led me to looking at the definition in the original Greek and Hebrew words that are translated as fear, and actually using some of all this money we spend on seminary, because I'm like, okay, I've got the tools. I should be able to do this, right? Okay. The main definition for both words, as you would expect, is what we normally mean by fear. But I found that the Hebrew word in the Old Testament says that when that word applies to God, the word can also be translated as awe or reverence, and that one of the definitions of the Greek word translated as fear is reverence or respect. Now we're talking, right? When the Bible tells us we should fear God, that just means we should respond to God with reverence, respect, and awe. That matches just how I thought it should be. How about you? I spent a glorious day content that I could come in and share that great news with you, and we could all walk away happy, having solved the puzzle and not having to think too hard. Except the next day while I was praying, I had this feeling that I wasn't off the hook yet, and that I had to dig a little deeper. I went back and looked at all the Bible verses that speak about fearing God again, and I found a few that warranted another look. So we've got Jeremiah 5:22. Shouldn't you fear me, declares the Lord, and tremble before me, the one who set the shoreline for the sea, an ancient boundary that it can't pass. Though its waves may rise and roar, they can't pass the limits I have set. And then in Philippians 2:12, therefore, my loved ones, just as you always obey me, not just when I am present, but now even more while I am away, carry out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Try as I might, I just can't convince myself that fear, when used for trembling, is just talking about reverence and respect. Maybe awe, but even that doesn't quite work in this context. Well, rats, it's no fun when I can't force the Bible to say what I want it to. Ugh. So back to thinking about God and fear and the nature of fear. We're supposed to love God. How can you love someone that you fear? I spent some time thinking about my parents. I'll say that honestly, I was a little afraid of my father when I was growing up. When I was raised, pretty much everybody spanked their kids when they misbehaved, and my dad was no exception. My mom took a different tack. Lots of parents would say, this will hurt me more than it will hurt you when they spank their kids. I guess implying that their emotional pain was for having to punish you was going to be worse than their pain. Well, with my mom's crippling arthritis, it was literally true in her case. And as an aside, I learned the hard way that offering to trade places with my dad and spank him, since that hurt more, was not the way to go. Okay, so instead of spanking, when we misbehaved, my mother would say things like, it's not so much that I'm angry, I'm just disappointed. I expected more from you. Oh, bang. Guilt, right? Much worse than physical pain. And it worked. I would avoid bad behavior for fear of disappointing my mother. So I thought, well, that must be what it means to fear God. We're afraid of disappointing God. That's the ticket. This kind of fear inspires us to follow God's commandments and to live righteously. And it doesn't make me shift my current beliefs in any way, so that's a win-win. I was so pleased with this theory that I shared it with Colin when I was over at his house working on the video editing that I mentioned earlier. I was drawing a parallel between how God disciplines us and the way my mom did rather than the way my dad did. And so our fear of God is really just fear of disappointing God. Colin said something offhand about how that wasn't always the case with him and that sometimes God had given him a good smack to get him off the wrong path. And I had to admit that that was true for me too. So that comment kept coming back to me the next day, and I knew I still wasn't done with this topic. Honestly, I had to admit to myself that fearing disappointing God is different than fearing God, and that I had been just trying to make that be true because it was easy. And the Bible doesn't say that we should fear disappointing God, right? It says we should fear God. So I must confess to cursing Colin quite a bit that day. Fortunately, he made up for it by giving me the next clue I needed to continue my search. So anyone who has ever been at the church when Bree and the girls arrive has the joy of witnessing the wonderful reunion that happens between Colin and his daughters every time. When he sees them coming in the door, his whole face lights up. He stops whatever he's doing and hurries to greet them. And the girls come running over to him with an enthusiasm that makes it look like they haven't seen him for months instead of hours, right? The love between them is just crystal for anybody who's here. Well, that same night that Colin and I were editing videos, at one point the girls had been put to bed but hadn't stayed there. We could hear them walking in the hallway outside the door where we were working. Now, all Colin had to do was open the door and look at them. And they went scurrying back to bed as fast as their feet could move. Now, while I'm sure the girls respect their father and don't want to disappoint him, I really don't think that's what set them racing back to bed. They knew that if they misbehaved too badly, that stern look would turn into a stern talking to. And it didn't feel like too big of a stretch to say that they feared this stern talking to, and in the role of potential stern talker, that they feared him. After all, isn't that the job of a good parent, right? Aren't they responsible for making sure that their kids do the things that they need to for their own good and use discipline to make them do things even when they don't want to? Colin and the kids were a clear example for me that you could both love someone and have a healthy fear of them too. So for there, I tried to take an honest look at how I feel about God, not how I think I should feel about God, but how I really do. I spent a few days trying to figure out whether or not I feared God as well as loving God. An incident just yesterday helped answer that question. I was talking to God and thanking God for all the blessings I have. And I acknowledged that I'm not as grateful as I should be for everything that God has given me and done for me. It was on my lips to ask God to teach me to be more grateful when I stopped dead. And you know why? I was afraid. As the words started coming out of my mouth, I realized that the easiest way for God to make me more grateful for what I have would be to take it away from me. Think Job. And even though I knew that becoming more grateful would help me grow as a Christian, I wanted my stuff more than I wanted that growth. I realized that I fear God because I trust God. I trust God to do what's good for me even when I don't want God to. I trust God to move me from activities that are barriers to my Christian growth or that push me away from righteousness instead of toward it, even when I don't want God to, even when it's painful. And that this is part of sanctification. This kind of pain is not punishment in the sense of retribution for sin. God clearly doesn't want us to receive the pain that we deserve, which is why God sent Jesus to suffer that pain for us. But sometimes God's lessons are not pleasant when they're teaching and growing us. I thought of an analogy for this that helped me understand it a little bit better. I struggle with arthritis, which I know will get worse over time. I know that exercise and strength training will have a positive effect on that down the line. I further know that I don't have enough knowledge of physiology to do strength training right, so that I help myself instead of hurt myself. And I'm also unmotivated, so left to my own device, I would not do it. So I hired a personal trainer who is both my teacher and my coach. He guides me through lifting weights so that they strengthen me. And he pushes me pretty hard. Sometimes the exercises are painful at the time. Often they are painful the next day. But I willingly give him authority to cause me this pain because I trust he will only do so for my good. Similarly, God is our coach in righteousness. We should open ourselves to his training knowing that some of it will be unpleasant or even painful, but that it will always be for our good, even when it's scary. While I say I want to grow to be like Jesus, mostly I want God to accomplish this by just saying the word and having it be so. A lot of times, if I was honest, I want comfort more than I want to work toward Christian growth. Mostly, I would prefer to sit on my hind end watching the Great British Baking Show over working out my salvation with fear and trembling. I mean, God spoke the whole world into existence. How hard would it be for him just to speak me into being a better person? But as anybody who's ever prayed for patience can testify, that's not how God works. God doesn't, poof, make you better. He trains you to be better. So now I recognize that I do fear God and that I have a reason to fear God. God cares more about my character than my comfort, and a lot of times I don't. But why is that a good thing that I fear God? Wouldn't it be better if I was so committed to Christian growth that any pain required there would be insignificant and there would be no fear, like Paul says? I think it would be, but I, for one, am just not there yet. In Proverbs, we saw that it says that wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. I think the word begins is key there. I think this is because the fear stems from recognizing that God is in control, not me. God judges what I need to happen for me, what needs to happen for me to grow, not me. God decides where and when I need correction or redirection, not me. If I need training that will make me grow, but it will be unpleasant or even painful, God cares too much about me to shield me from it. Even if I knew what was good for me, I might not do it on my own, so it's a good thing that God is in control. Our rebellion in the fallen Genesis was the result of us trying to wrest control away from God and claim it for ourselves. Our healthy fear of God shows that we recognize that it's God who is the one in control, and understanding this is the beginning of wisdom. Well, I don't want to give the impression that I think every difficult or painful time comes from God to grow us. No, definitely no. Most difficult times are the result of the fact we're in a broken and fallen world. But I do think sometimes that may appear in the short term to be challenging are actually to our ultimate good and to further us in our Christian journey and may come from God. I further believe that God uses everything that happens to us, the good things and the bad things, for good regardless of their origin. Well, that's what I've come to understand so far about what it means to fear God. For me, this has been a valuable, if somewhat unpleasant journey, which seems highly appropriate given what I learned as I was going through it. I no longer entirely see fearing God as a strange or a bad thing. And I hope that this new understanding will help me be more open, more receptive, and maybe even a little bit grateful when I'm going through difficult or painful times, since I know that God will support and strengthen me in these times and use them to move me forward in my Christian walk. I hope that someday my faith is strong enough that I'll accept this without fear. But for now, I'll strive to continue moving forward in fear and trembling. Thanks be to God.